Okay, there we go. Take it away, Arjun.
Lovely. Am I clearly audible? I will try to hopefully go slow and cover most of the key concepts. Today, I will be covering the US Congress, what it is, how it operates, how political stuff gets done, what are its powers, its limitations, its strengths, how America's legislative body is able to do things. So, from chronological order, we'll cover what Congress does, the House, the Senate, committees, and caucuses, how a bill becomes a law in more detail than your horrible US history class covered it, then the federal appropriations and budget process, which I swear is the most confusing sounding thing on this planet, gerrymandering and voting rights, the upcoming general elections, and swing states and how they work. Cool. So, Article 1, Section 1 of the Constitution vests all legislative powers in Congress, in the Senate, and in the House. What that means is two things. The first is that Congress is the supreme law of the land. That is, federal law is supreme over all state law. This is also reinforced in, I believe, Article 6 in the Constitution, which means that if Congress says abortion rights are legal, a state can't say, no, you can't have women's rights, because that would be illegal because federal law is supreme. The second thing this does is it ensures that the legislative powers are vested in Congress and not in the presidency. So the president needs congressional approval to be able to do a lot of things, like to spend money, to raise taxes, to go to war, to sign treaties. A lot of the presidential and executive powers, although not all of them, are contingent upon congressional approval. That is to say, a bill must pass Congress and be signed by the president for this to actually happen. An important thing to note here is that Congress's legislative power is not absolute because the president of the United States has what's called a veto. That is, the president can just choose not to sign the bill, and unless two-thirds of Congress says, no, you can't do that, the veto stands. And given that two-thirds of Congress rarely agrees on anything, from human rights to gun control to whether or not they should be paid more money, well, they might agree a lot on that one. The president's veto usually does put in a lot of congressional power in check. So on the first slide, what is Congress and how does it operate? One moment. Okay, there we go. So effectively, the way in which Congress operates is that both the House and the Senate are separate. So they're run separately with separate officers, they're separate institutions, but they're equal. That means that bills and most other things have to pass through both chambers in order to be considered laws. However, both the House and the Senate have specific different powers allocated to them. What do I mean by this? It is the US Senate, for example, that confirms military and political nominees, like the Secretary of State or the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And while the House can scrutinize those appointees, they cannot decide not to appoint them. That is a power solely reserved to the United States Senate. However, most things share both. The way in which the House works is that it's comprised of 435 voting members. This number is constant. It doesn't go up and it doesn't go down. And 6 non-voting delegates from territories like Puerto Rico and the District of Columbia, meaning you need 218 seats for a majority, as that is, well, a majority. The next part is important. Representatives are allocated to each state by population size, with every state guaranteed at least one member of Congress. What that often means is that a state like Wyoming may have a congressperson that represents fewer or greater numbers of people than a congressperson from a state like Texas or California. However, the way in which this operates is that the number of seats go up and down based on each US census. So what that means is that after the upcoming census is completed, Texas will likely gain congresspeople, and the reason for this is because they have gained population size, and California will likely lose a few members. Note that states allocate the congressional districts in their state. So while each state has a set number of congresspeople, they draw the maps as to what each district looks like. This sounds not very important now, but it will become very important later. The United States Senate is comprised of 101 members. That is 100 voting members, 50 senators, 50 states, 2 senators from each state, and the vice president, who is, by the Constitution, president of the Senate, but can only vote in a tiebreaker. 50 senators vote one way, 50 vote the other way. Before we go on, are there any questions? Lovely. This is no longer correct. The House is currently under the control of the Republican Party, who have 221 seats. Again, 3 more than the requirement for a majority. The leader of the House is currently House Speaker Mike Johnson, the leader of the largest party in Congress. The House Majority Leader is the Speaker's deputy, and the House Majority Whip is his deputy, or hers. The leader of the opposition is currently, well, Hakeem Jeffries, the leader of the House Democratic Caucus. This is a little bit out of date, but what I just told you is more correct. What's more important is that Democrats are divided into 2 distinct groups, moderates and progressives. The Congressional Progressive Caucus has 95 House members and is chaired by Pramila Jayapal, Democrat from Washington. The Squad are a group of 6 left-wing Democrats who often break with mainstream Democrats on things like aid for Israel. Since this lecture was originally made, something quite massive shifted. Normally, the House Speaker would just be the leader of the largest party in the House, and that was Kevin McCarthy. Unfortunately, well, perhaps if you're a Democrat like me, fortunately, the Republicans collapsed. That is, the Freedom Caucus, a group of far-right legislators, just refused to back in any capacity most Republican nominees for Speaker. Initially, they backed McCarthy, who was party leader, but he lost support, and then it took them over a week to decide on a new Speaker, Mike Johnson, which just shows the Speaker of the House ought to be able to command the confidence of the House of Representatives. If they can't do things. Why is the Speaker uniquely important? Because the Speaker sets things like committee assignments and determines what bills end up reaching it to the floor, which is why the Speaker is so important. Let's cover the Senate. Again, this shifted after the last midterms. The Senate is now under a Democratic majority. The Vice President has a tie-breaking vote. And even though there aren't technically 50 Democrats, I think it's the current split is 51-49 officially. Senators Sanders and King are independents, but they caucus with the Democrats. Unfortunately, unlike the House, to get a bill passed in the Senate, you often need more than a majority. And the reason for this is a really stupid thing called the filibuster, which is a Senate policy allowing any member to talk for an unlimited amount of time during a session, thus being able to kill a bill. And this can only be overridden by 60 senators present. This has resulted in quite unfortunate things. The first really big issue with this is that it oftentimes stops bills from being passed in their entirety, even if they have a majority of support, like Biden's Build Back Better bill, for example. Or more notably, US Senator Tommy Tuberville from Alabama literally held up something like 150 military confirmations by filibustering for a number of months. The leader of the Senate is the Senate Majority Leader, Chuck Schumer. His deputy is the Senate Majority Whip. And of course, the Republicans have the Senate Minority Leader and the Senate Minority Whip. 2 moderate Republicans, Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins, often vote with Democrats, and 2 moderate Democrats, Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, often vote with the Republicans. It's important to note that Joe Manchin is actually retiring, and Kyrsten Sinema is now an independent. And therefore, we don't know what necessarily will happen going forward. For a bill to become law, it must pass the relevant committee, which are made up of members of both political parties. These committees have oversight over US cabinet members and their departments. So when Tim Geithner wants money for the US Treasury to give to banks, he has to go before Congress to testify. Geithner is no longer Treasury Secretary, but he had to do that. Important committees include intelligence, appropriations, ways and means, finance, and foreign affairs. A caucus is a group of like-minded people in the House, the Senate, or both, like the Democratic Caucus, the Republican Conference, and the Freedom Conference that often have say in how these things operate. How does a bill become a law? Because there are 8 steps here. The first is the bill has to be proposed, then it has to be reviewed by its committee and pass it. So, for example, a bill on foreign affairs has to pass the House and Senate Foreign Relations Committee. It has to be sent to the House and the Senate floor by the committee chair. It has to pass. Then it has to go to the other chamber, repeat the process, and then to be signed into law. Note that Congress is often able to pass a lot of bills that both political parties broadly agree upon quite easily, like, for example, doing things like confirming military nominees, which is actually a power that only the Senate has. But obviously, this does make passing contentious things quite challenging. Similarly, it is quite hard for the budget to be passed. This is probably the topic that will come up the most when you talk about Congress. That is, I guarantee you, around budget season, there will be a question on this in every single domestic extemp tournament, which is the federal appropriations and budget process. Federal agencies submit their budget request to the president for review. That is, the federal agencies like the Department of Defense or like state will tell the president how much they need. Then the president will submit his budget requests to Congress, typically around February after the fiscal year ends. Then the House and Senate will have to review the budget and pass it. Then there has to be a joint committee comprised of both the House and the Senate to approve the resolution. And then subcommittee members in the House and Senate appropriations committees have to approve the budget. Then it has to pass the House and Senate floor votes, then go through the conference committee again, and then be signed into law. This means that it is functionally impossible to get a budget passed without bipartisan support. And that's what leads to things like, for example, the government shutdown, where a budget couldn't be passed in time, and both in, for example, the Trump and I think briefly in the Biden administrations, federal workers had to go without money. Note that the budget is really, really important, because without it, the government literally doesn't have very much money. That is to say, at the point at which this happens, federal agencies can't pay their workers, and that's really, really bad for Americans who work on the ground, and it stops the federal government from effectively being able to govern. The last big topic we're going to cover today, and I'm going to spend quite a bit of time on this, is gerrymandering and voting rights, because I really want you all to have a good conceptualization of how this operates. Note that the state legislature gets to decide how seats for their Senate in the US House of Representatives are decided. Often, the political party in control of the state's legislature will redistrict seats to their party's advantage, which is called gerrymandering. Now, effectively, what this means is, I live in Texas, right? In my state of Texas, the Texas House will often draw district maps that are favorable to usually their political party. So, for example, what this means is that in some particular states, like in Texas, for example, there'll be, for example, a drawing of lines that get a majority of minority voters in one particular area to one district to stop multiple districts from being competitive. Both Democrats and Republicans gerrymander. They do it a lot. Some states like Delaware don't gerrymander at all. But note that gerrymandering is really bad because it disrupts how fair elections are. That is to say, if I live in a district that was drawn to have a Republican advantage based on polling, even if a majority of residents in my city are Democratic, we may end up sending one Democratic and one Republican representative to the US House, which undermines American democracy. And perhaps the bigger problem is that a lot of GOP-run states are just attacking voting rights. So first are voting ID laws that are disproportionately targeted towards minorities. For example, oftentimes in GOP-run states, they just won't check your ID if you are, for example, not a person of color. Secondarily, there are often mail-in ballot restrictions. What that means is that a lot of times people cannot physically vote. So if I'm studying abroad in the UK at the time of the election, I obviously can't physically go to the polls and cast my vote. A lot of people, similarly, in states cannot cast a physical vote because they'll be working at the time, they have their job, or they just can't make it that far to a particular voting station. So a lot of times people will vote using mail-in ballots. A restriction of these makes it empirically a lot harder to vote and therefore constricts people's capacity to be able to cast their vote. And the third and most egregious example of attacks on voting rights is this thing called poll watching, where oftentimes civilians will be allowed with arms to be able to do things like, for example, watch polls to ensure that people are casting their votes correctly, which can often intimidate people, causing them to not vote in the first place. Before I go on to cover swing states and the upcoming general election, do we have any questions?
Yeah, so what are majority and minority whips in the Senate and the House?
Sure. So the whips basically have two purposes. The first is to deputize for their leaders. So if a leader is sick or if they're not available to do this particular job, they deputize for them. But the second and the more impactful job of a whip is to whip the votes. They're in charge of getting people from their political party to vote for a particular bill or to vote against it. So if you're the Senate Majority Whip and you want a Democratic bill that President Biden is supporting to pass, you'll whip the votes in favor. Whips are often quite shady actors. They can do things like blackmail individuals. If you've watched House of Cards, if you're old enough to have watched House of Cards, Kevin Spacey's character, Frank Underwood, was initially the House Majority Whip. Upcoming general elections look pretty bad. The Senate elects a third of its members at the time, and unfortunately, there are quite a few Democrats in competitive or swing states up for re-election, so we might lose the Senate in 2024, we meaning the Democratic Party, but we also will likely end up winning the House, given that a lot of House seats have become more competitive because there was backlash against the Supreme Court's anti-abortion rights ruling in Dobbs v. Jackson. I think that covers mostly everything about how Congress works. I want to give the Extempers Bible people a shout out for hosting me. And also, I want to make their lives a little bit easier and end 2 minutes ahead of time so they have time to move to their next activity. It was lovely doing this. See you, folks.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Arjun.